Eliza Orzeszkowa, The Argonauts. Did you like it? Subscribe and recommend to friends. Chapter 17, From Street to Street, and from one alley of the public garden to another, passed Arthur Kranitsky with the step and the mien of a person who is strolling through a city without great desire or object. In his shining hat and well-fitting fur coat, on the costly collar of which traces of wear were observable, the man seemed notably older and poorer in some sort than he had been during a past which was still recent. In his erect form and springy step one might discover that disagreeable effort with which people guard themselves when they fear lest observers may penetrate their sad secret in some way. But despite every effort, Kranitsky's secret was manifest sometimes in his stooping shoulders, drooping head, pendant cheeks, and dimmed glances. All this was the more evident since Pan Arthur was advancing in the full gleam of the sun, which flooded with light the sidewalks of the streets and the alleys of the great public garden. The end of the winter had been exceptionally mild and serene. The snow had almost melted away, and only, here and there, mingled its dull white with the azure of the sky and the golden hue of the atmospheres. While passing multitudes of people, Kranitsky raised his hand to his hat frequently, and at times, with a smile which was winning, nay, almost seductive, he made movements as if to approach or even spring forward to those whom he greeted. But they, with a courteous though prompt inclination, moved past the man swiftly. These persons were stylish young gentlemen conversing with one another vivaciously, or young ladies hastening to some point. They returned bow after bow, but none took note of Kranitsky's desire to draw near, or at least none had the wish to observe it. Each man or woman had some person at his side or hers with whom to converse, and was going, or even hastening, to some place. How recent and intimate had been his acquaintance with those persons! Lai had known them from early childhood. He knew everything touching them, the names and life histories of their parents, the nicknames given them in jest or in tenderness, names given at an age when they were barely lisping. He knew every chamber, almost every corner of the houses in which they had been reared. He had raised many of them in his strong arms from the floor, he who at that time was the praised, the beloved, the sought for. He who had amused and entertained them, was he indeed to imagine a day when they would pass him at a distance and indifferently? How could he? He with rosy glasses on his eyes, those eyes famed at that period for beauty, had been given to tenderness and attachments. He had considered the feelings and relations of men as eternal, but from various causes a multitude of his relations with people had ended already, and now they were ending to the last one. He had the vivid sensation of hanging in a vacuum, and felt a growing need to grasp after something or someone, lest he might tumble into a place which he knew not, but which he felt must be abyss-like. At the beginning of his walk he thought that in that bright hour of the day when throngs of gaily dressed people were covering the sidewalks, and the middle of the street was filled with passing carriages, some person would stop him, would invite him, would attend him somewhere, or take him to some place. What was he to do now? Whither was he to go? Baron Emil, whose medieval mansion had been in recent days almost his one refuge from weariness and lonely tedium, had gone to his estate to make trips in various directions and search in village cottages and under their roofs for remnants of art which were genuine or suitable. He was to return soon, but meanwhile Kranitsky could not sit in the broad chair before Tristan, who was giving obeisance on the wall of the chamber to Isolde, nor sit at the table where, besides gastronomic tidbits, he found conversation to which he was accustomed, nor in presence of the triumph of death, sweeping through the air on bat wings, or experience the tone of beyond-the-worldness. With the departure of the Baron, he lost the only ground on which he met Marion, that dear child. The very thought now of Marion, from whom after so many years of life in common he was separated, brought tears to Kranitsky's eyelids. He took a seat on a bench of the garden, and wishing to light a cigarette, drew the golden case from his pocket. He did not light the cigarette, however, for there, beyond the low paling near which he was sitting, passed a splendid carriage drawn by 2 horses and bearing servants in livery. In that carriage sat a man of 30 years, at sight of whom Kranitsky pushed forward as if to rush after him, as if to fly like the wind to him. This young man was the son of Count Alfred, of him whom Kranitsky had nursed with endless devotion during illness under the sky of Italy. In those days the young man was a child, and remembered little of the hours in which Kranitsky had occupied in his family the place of the best of friends, and somewhat that of the most faithful of servants. Afterward he forgot those hours completely, and put away by degrees that excellent Kranitsky, who was growing old. And though this Kranitsky, on a time, had rendered some sort of service to the young man's father, he had been rewarded richly by resorting to the house for years, and very likely by loans of money given frequently and with no thought of payment. Very wealthy and a frequent traveler, Count Arthur's son had too many affairs on his head, and too many in it to cherish any desire of stuffing it further with old-fashioned trumpery. Kranitsky soon observed this frame of mind in the young son of his former friend and protector, and he had long considered that house as lost and its master as a stranger. This did not sadden him at first overmuch, for he had a port, which he entered with, full sail at all times. But now the passing sight of that young man struck his heart with something which cut and burned at the same instant. Services are forgotten, ties are broken, the past is rejected. Oh, the ingratitude of mankind! And still, with what delight would he have ridden through the streets of the city on such a spring day in that carriage with rubber ties, bearing the persons within it on yielding cushions with the soft movement of a cradle. With a still greater feeling of delight would he have conversed while going with someone who possessed the same habits, tastes, and relations which he had. With what vivid satisfaction would he halt before one of the best restaurants of that city to have an exquisite lunch, between walls decorated with taste and amid sounds of joyfulness. But all those things which on a time were as cheap as good morning are now as remote and unattainable as the blue sky above him. In his closely drawn coat, and bent over so much that his shoulders took the form of a half-circle, in his hat, from beneath which black hair was visible, and a row of furrows above his dark brows, he gazed at the street which stretched along outside the paling, and in his fingers, covered with Danish gloves, he twirled the golden toy from habit. The hat shone like satin above his head, and on tire cigarette ease, which he twirled in his fingers, the sun gleams were crossing one another. The street beyond that paling lay before a square which was rather extensive. This square seemed dominated by two lofty buildings, before the ornamented fronts of which there was a great movement of people. Through the broad doors of these buildings a throng of men went in and came out. Equipages stopped before them. On the steps which led up to them halted, advanced, decreased, and again increased, a crowd of figures clad in black, noisy, gesticulating, occupied passionately in some work. No wonder. These were the bank and the exchange, which stood with opposing fronts, and with their multitude of windows seemed to gaze eye to eye at each other. Kranitsky looked neither at these piles, nor the throng of men circulating about them. He had never had anything in common with activity in those buildings. But all at once he bent forward a second time, and fixed his eyes on a carriage which passed the paling, or rather he fixed them on the man sitting in it. It was Aloysius Darvid, who, on that sunny day, was in an open carriage drawn by a pair of large, costly horses, which, in light harness without mounting, stepped slowly, with grace and importance. On the box sat a coachman and footman, in high hats and immense fur collars. In the carriage, finished in sapphire damask, a man of not large stature, slender, with pale face, ruddy side whiskers, and with the glitter of a golden spark in the glasses which covered his eyes. Slowly, with dignity, the carriage with muffled sound of rubber-bound wheels halted before the bank entrance. The footman sprang from the box, stood at the door, and taking a card from his master's hand, hurried into the building. 5 minutes had not passed when out came two serious persons who approached the carriage hastily and began to converse with the man sitting in it. Surely officials, even dignitaries of the bank, whom he had summoned by 2 words outlined on the card. To go to them, to ascend the high steps, he had not time perhaps, so they ran down those steps to him. They did not walk down, they ran, and now, with the most courteous smiles in the world, and with raising of hats above their important heads, these men seemed to counsel with him about something, to indicate some point, to promise. While he, ever unchanged, perfectly polite though cold, with a shade of sarcasm on his lean face, rather listened than spoke, and with a golden spark in his glasses, against a background of bright sapphire damask, had the seeming of a demigod. In 5 minutes' time the conversation was over. Darvid inclined with befitting profoundness. The officers bowed much lower their hats above their heads. With the muffled sound of rubber tires, with the slow and important gait of the splendid horses, that carriage moved on, described a large circle, and stopped at the long and broad steps leading up to the edifice opposite. Here the footman opened the carriage door. Darvid alighted and began to ascend the steps, where a dense throng of men, dressed in black, opened before him as a wave opens to an oncoming vessel. That must be no common craft, for along the wave of men, quivers passed as they passed through one living organism at the touch of an electric current. The opening throng formed eddies, whispered, was silent. A number of hands were raised toward heads, and hats or caps hung in the air. A multitude of faces were turned toward that one face and fixed their eyes on it. These movements had in them an expression of timid curiosity, an expression which seemed almost humble. The most confident stepped forth from the throng with bared heads, and with steps which were either too slow or too hurried, but never such steps as they made habitually. These men approached the newly arrived and spoke to him of something. They were doubtless inquiring, taking counsel, perhaps petitioning, for all those acts were expressed in their movements and on their faces. Thus was formed something like that retinue of the elite who surround a demigod, and between the two walls of people, along the splendid steps of the stairway, they went up with him higher and higher to the entrance of the temple, and vanished there with him. The heads of the common crowd were covered with hats and caps now, but many eyes, unable to gaze on Phaeton himself, turned to his chariot, and were fixed for a long time yet on its sapphire-colored damask, which was warmed by the sun rays, and on those two splendid animals which, standing there in trained fixedness, seemed like bronze steeds of the sun before the gates of that money mart. Krenitsky, sitting on the garden bench, had grown rigid in the posture described above, his mouth awry, his eyes gleaming. So this is what has happened. In a few weeks after the death of the hapless Kara, he is active and triumphant. He hurls his lariat on the golden calf and captures new millions. A demigod, a titan, the king of markets, he sweeps forward in 7-league boots over roads, at the crossing points of which are Americans with milliards. They are millionaires no longer, but masters of milliards. He is the man who, as Baron Emil said, knows how to will. Still, how small he seemed and devoid of desire at the hour when he stood near the corpse of his daughter, joined with the silent smoke of the censer, which rose like light mist in the air. How petty he appeared at that juncture, crushed, as it were, by some giant hand, not a demigod in any sense, or a titan, but rather an insect, pushing into some narrow cranny to hide from a bird of prey. Krenitsky had seen Darvid then, for, on hearing of the misfortune, no power on earth or in hell could have stopped him from running, from flying to the house where it had happened. That misfortune had pierced his heart, and straightway he felt, also, those inward and other pains which for some time had attacked him without pity and more frequently. But in spite of his pains, he ran on without a thought that he had been forbidden that house, or a thought of what might meet him within it. He entered, and by well-known ways went directly to the chambers of the lady. Happen what might, he must see, in such a terrible moment, that woman, that saint, that mild and noble being. She was surrounded by many. There was a throng of people about her, but he did not see who they were, nor did he think what they might say of him. Before his eyes was a mist which veiled all things in front of him, save the face of that woman so dreadfully changed and grown old recently, that woman who no longer had the bright aureole of pale, golden hair above her forehead, but on that forehead and across the whole width of it was the dark furrow of a deep wrinkle. Without seeing or greeting a person, he walked up to her directly, and, dropping on his knees, pressed to his lips the hem of her mourning garment. He did this without the trace of a plan, without forethought. He did it through an impulse which threw him at the feet of the woman. That action came from his heart, and from his heart only. For never was anyone like her, he thought. Many a time he had had fortune with women. In life he had been loved, and had loved in various fashions, but as he had loved her, never had he loved woman. He did not remember, he was unconscious of what happened after that, but it seemed that Irene seized in her arms the loudly weeping lady, that Marion was there also, and many other persons, who, going in and passing out with silent tread and low words, produced a sound something like the rustle of leaves when they are falling. In some corner of the chamber he sat down, or stood up, he cannot tell which. He only remembers that he was surrounded by the odor of alder blossoms which filled the chamber, till, finally, he felt that it was late, that he had to go out just as had others. He could not be with that beloved being in her suffering. Of all pains that was the most unendurable. But life contains sometimes such cruelties. Life at times is atrocious. He went once again to look at the little one. He saw her, and with her the demigod, in such a position that he thought, here, too, is a man who is ended. At this point of meditation, Kranitsky rested his elbow on the arm of the bench, shaded his eyes with his palm, and placed before his imagination that wonderful sight which seemed a fable, a dream to him. What luxury, what originality of thought and taste, what a mountain of gold was poured out there. The plan and the taste were seemingly Marion's. The grand drawing-room had been turned into a grotto, which, from floor to ceiling, was covered with soft folds of white crepe and muslin, meeting above in a gigantic rosette, resembling the mystic four-leafed roses painted on Gothic church windows, save that this one, at which the wavy drapery met and hid walls and ceiling, was as white and soft as if formed by the fantastic play of cloud substance. But everything in that chamber, the walls, the arch, the rosette, seemed made up of clouds and of snow, on which had fallen an immense rain of white flowers, white only. In garlands woven together, or cast about without order by the movement of hands, they clung to the walls and the vault, covered the floor, were scattered over everything, were visible everywhere, and seemed to have fallen out of every place. Aside from them and among them, there was nothing but abundance of light. Stars, bunches, columns were formed of lights, burning in branch holders and candlesticks. It is unknown where they were invented. So uncommon were these holders and candlesticks, so fantastic. They were so peculiar in style that it would seem as if they had been brought from the dream world of an excited fancy to the world of existence. There was no color, no tinsel, no emblem of death, nothing in that sea of snowy whiteness, save an avalanche of snow-covered flowers and the dazzling gleam of burning tapers, with the odor of lilies of the valley, roses, alder blossoms, hyacinths, to which was added incense of some kind, as peculiar as was everything in that chamber. This incense, burning it was unknown in what place, sent hither and thither through the air, from time to time, small grayish cloudlets of smoke amid the gleam of the lights and tinged by the gold of them. In that chamber were virginity, with an atmosphere of mysticism, inventiveness unwilling to recognize the impossible, a chapter of magic, a strophe of a poem, and in it, as a central point for all else, was the slender form of Kara on a lofty place, fallen asleep calmly, arrayed as in a bridal robe, with her delicate face, which in the pale, golden hair, with a shade of whiteness barely discernible, emerged from the flood of snowy crepe and flowers. In that flood of snowy white, in that gleaming brilliance of the tapers, in that richness of intoxicating odors, in that atmosphere of haze moving from the burning censer, Kara was sleeping calmly, with the smooth arches of her dark brows below the Grecian outline of her forehead. On her closed lips was a smile which was almost gladsome. It must have been late at night when Kranitsky rose from his knees and found himself alone in that chamber. Outside, the words and prayers of watchers were heard murmuring beyond the doors and the walls, but there the sleep of death seemed to reign alone. After a while, however, something rustled near one of the walls. Kranitsky looked around and saw a man who seemed at first to be an undefined patch on the snowy background. After a few seconds he recognized Darvid's features in ruddy side whiskers, but he strained his eyes rather long, inquiring whether he was not mistaken. Neither sorrow nor despair, commonly roused by death in the living, but something still greater and beyond that was depicted in the look and the posture of Darvid. His eyes, usually so clear, so positive, so like glittering steel, had in them now an abyss of thought at the bottom of which terror was secreted, while the form of the man seemed shrunk and crushed down. Neither irony, nor energy, nor bold certainty of self was in it now. He looked smaller than usual, and in the manner of bending his head forward there was something of the vanquished. The soft folds at which he stood surrounded him in such a way that he seemed flattened, and recalled definitely, like an insect in flight which was trying to push through a narrow crack to escape before something immense which was swooping down suddenly. He turned his eyes toward Kranitsky, recognized the man, and casting an indifferent glance at him, gazed again in another direction at the enormous something. He had no feeling of hatred or contempt or offense. Kranitsky, on his part, had none of those feelings either. He thought that various tales and dramas represent mortal enemies who, in moments like that, reach their hands to one another and are reconciled. Pathos is not truthful. It has no sufficient reason. What are men's quarrels or agreements in presence of this? He looked a little longer at the maiden sleeping under the shower of white blossoms, and whispered, "Death! Yes, yes, death, eternal sleep!" Then, with drooping head, he went forth from that grotto, which was snow-white and gleaming with lights. He was so broken that he dragged himself out of it rather than walked. Now, on the bench of the garden, Kranitsky raised his face from his palms and looked at the exchange. The porch with its broad steps was empty, but Darvid's carriage was there yet, showing a spot of gleaming sapphire in the sunny air. The horses stood in trained fixedness, like statues cast from bronze. Kranitsky's lips were awry with distaste. With a bitterness to which his mild nature came rarely, he whispered, "Labor, iron labor." With lips full of gall, not thinking now of straightening his shoulders or giving his steps an appearance of elasticity, he dragged along from street to street, halting sometimes for a moment before the gates of the grandest houses. Each one of these reminded him of something, of some brilliant or happy moment, of some fragment of the past. This one he had entered while going to one of the smaller or greater stars of his existence. Out of that one he had gone when taking the ailing Count Alfred to Italy. Through this one he had hurried daily to do some kindness for Prince Zeno. That one brought to him the memory of a certain ball, so brilliant that it bordered upon fairyland. Now all these gates and those mansions are for him like that hall which guests have deserted, in which the lights are extinguished, and through which a man finds his way with a night lamp, remembering as he passes a spot where had gleamed the naked shoulders of a beauty, or another where the faces of joyous comrades had smiled at him, a third where had risen the odor of flowers or the odor of roast pheasants. At last, late in the afternoon, Mother Clemens heard a ring in the antechamber, and ran along the floor in her clattering old overshoes, hastening to answer the doorbell. On her broad shoulders was a barred kerchief, in her hand was a needle with a thick thread, and above her eyes, now growing dim, a second pair of eyes, which were glass, in spectacles raised to the woman's wrinkled forehead. Commenced she immediately. "I thought that thou hadst fastened for the day in some pleasant company. But Arabian adventure, thou hast returned before evening. This is well, for guests have been here, and they will come again shortly." "Guests?" inquired Kranitsky, and his face cleared somewhat, but briefly, because Clemens snorted. "Yes, one of them was very important. Be pleased with the honor. Berek Schildman. He said that next week, as God is God, he would sell thy furniture." Seeing, however, that Kranitsky, after he had removed his coat, dragged his feet through the little drawing-room, and that red wrinkles came out above his brows, she grew mild and spoke in better humor. "But thou mayst take delight in two other guests who came, great dandies, and of thy company, though young enough to be thy sons." "Who were they? Who? Speak, mother." "How can I remember those Arabian names? But they left cards. Wait, I'll bring them this minute. I put them in the kitchen." She turned toward the kitchen, but right behind her, stepping almost on her heels, went Kranitsky, delighted and impatient. He almost snatched from her hand 2 visiting cards, on which he read the names, Marion Darvid and Baron Emil Blauendorf. "Ah!" cried he, "those dear children! The Baron has returned then, and his first thought after returning was of me. What a heart! I go, I run!" And indeed, he ran to the door of the antechamber, radiant, rejuvenated, but Mother Clemens stood in his way, squaring out her shoulders in the checkered kerchief. "Whither art thou going?" What for? Is it to meet them on the steps or at the gate? They said that they would come again in an hour. To each other they said that they would go to see the Nazarene. What Nazarene? Asked Krenitsky with astonishment. What Nazarene? But how should I know what Nazarene? It may be an image of the Lord Jesus of Nazareth. They only said that they would go to look at it and come back here. Come back, repeated Krenitsky. That is well. We shall have a talk. It is so long since I have had a talk with anyone, and I shall see Marion, the dear, dear boy. Krenitsky rubbed his hands. He walked with springy step and erect shoulders through the little drawing room, but not even delight could round his cheeks, which had dropped during recent days somewhat. Neither could it freshen the yellow tint on them. Mother Clemens halted in the middle of the room and followed him with her 2 pair of eyes. See, my lords, he is as if born again, as if called back to life. He stopped confused before her. Knowest what? Let mother run for a pate de foie gras and a bottle of liqueur. Mother Clemens dropped back to the wall. Jesus of Nazareth, hast thou gone mad, Tulek? Berek Schildman, thy furniture. What do I care for Berek Schildman? What do I care for furniture? Cried Krenitsky, when those noble hearts remember me. Hearts have no stomachs. There is no need of stuffing something into them the first minute. What does mother know? Mother is an honest woman, but her level is earth to earth. She only thinks of this cursed money. But is pâte de foie gras holy? Arabian adventure? Both voices were raised somewhat. Krenitsky threw himself on the sofa, pressed his right side with his palm, groaned. Then Clemens turned her face toward him. She had grown mild and seemed frightened. Well, has pain caught thee? It was clear that he was suffering, an old affliction of the liver and something of the heart in addition. Mother Clemens approached the sofa in her clattering overshoes. Well, do not excite thyself. What is to be done? How much money will that Arabian pate cost? And the liqueur, put in Krenitsky. When he had grown calm, he explained that the Baron was fond of liqueur, and that Marion was wild for pate and black coffee. Let mother prepare black coffee. Thou knowest how to do it perfectly. What more? Snorted she. Perhaps it would be well to take the panes from the windows and throw the stove down. Krenitsky spread out his arms. Why speak of the window panes and the stove? What meaning can the stove and the glass have? There is no comparison between black coffee and window panes or the stove. Mother irritates me. Again his face changed and he groaned. The old woman surrendered, but the question of money remained. Krenitsky took a bill out of his pocketbook, held it between 2 fingers, and thought, this is too small. That kind of liqueur which the Baron drinks is very expensive. Vexation was evident on his face. Clemens spoke up. Well, stop thinking, for if thou hast not a rouble, thou wilt not think out one in 100 years. Be calm. Only write all on a card for me. I will go and buy what is needed. Krenitsky struggled on the sofa. With what money wilt thou buy it, mother? But she was already in the doorway of the neighboring room, and gave no answer. Is it with thy own? Cried Krenitsky. Surely with thy own. I know that mother is spending her capital this good while. She came back with the checkered kerchief over her head, without spectacles, and ready for the errand. Well, what if I do spend it? Hast thou not Lipovka? Thou hast, and what I lend thou wilt return. Oi, oi! I stand with 1 foot in the grave, and should I fight about a rouble when thou art in need of it? Krenitsky raised his hands and his eyes. What a heart! Whispered he. What attachment! No one can equal the old servants of our ancient families. After a few minutes, steps were heard in the antechamber of people coming in, and the fresh voice of a man cried, May one see the master of this place? Krenitsky ran to the antechamber. Of course, my dears. You make me happy, altogether happy. And indeed he had the face of a man made happy, and also tilled with emotion, for taking his place in one of the armchairs opposite Marion, who sat in another, he listened to the Baron's narrative, which gave details of his recent expedition. Baron Emil was uncommonly vivacious, but at the same time he feigned to be more nervous and excited than usual. He did not sit down for 1 instant. Merci, merci, said he to the master of the house, who indicated a chair to him. I am in such a condition that really I cannot sit in one place. Something within me is toiling and crying and biting. I am full of trembling of hopes and of anger. A brick-colored rosy blush appeared on his yellow cheeks. As usual, he spoke through his nose and through his teeth, but more quickly than common. While walking through the drawing-room, he said that in smaller and greater country residences which he had visited, he had found a few remnants of former wealth, specimens of art and of ornamental industry, which were of considerable and sometimes even of high value. A multitude of these rich things had been acquired by the English, who had circled about through the country more than once in pursuit of them, but much remained yet, and the only need was to inquire, seek, examine, and it was possible to find real treasures, even often most unexpectedly. He halted before Marion. I say this because who, for example, could hope or expect to find in possession of a schoolmaster, a teacher of geography, an absolute Arcadian, a picture by Steinle hung behind a door, smoke befouled by flies, an undoubted, a genuine Steinle, Edward Steinle. But is it undoubted? Interrupted Marion. Once more I turn thy attention to certain traits which seem to speak in favor of Kupelweiser. What Kupelweiser? Cried the Baron, walking still more quickly through the drawing-room. No Kupelweiser, my dear. Not a shadow of a Kupelweiser. Kupelweiser, though the teacher of Steinle was considerably inferior to him in drawing. That firmness and elegance of outline, that harmony of composition, that piety, that genuine compunction which is dominant in the faces of the saints. That is Steinle, the purest Steinle, undoubted Steinle, whose collection of cartoons in Frankfurt. Was Steinle, for I do not recollect, pre-Raphaelite? Put in Kranitsky timidly, somewhat ashamed of his ignorance. Yes, if you like, answered the Baron. We may reckon among the pre-Raphaelites the German school of Nazarenes. But this school is distinct. Then surely you examined this Steinle today, my dears, before you came to me? Yes, we heard of it by chance. We went to examine it, and imagine, we found this pearl in the possession of an Arcadian who has neither a conception nor the shadow of a conception of the Nazarenes, or who Steinle. But perhaps we should pardon him, laughed Marion, for the Germans themselves know almost nothing of Steinle, who fell into disfavor among his successors. On the contrary, exclaimed the Baron, I beg pardon, my dear, real judges always value him highly, and he is greatly sought for by museums. His cartoons, when placed at the side of Overbeck's Triumph of Religion in Art, lose nothing. On the contrary, that compunction distinguishes his figures. But thou canst not compare him with Overbeck, said Marion with indignation. I can. I make him equal to Overbeck, and I consider him superior to Furich and Veit. I will give thee Veit, but as to Overbeck, that marvelous melancholy which fills the eyes of his women, it is earthly, rather than that perfect expression from beyond which is dominant in Steinle's figures. In this regard, Steinle is the only man whom we may compare with Fra Angelico. I would rather compare him with Lippomani. Perhaps, said the Baron, half agreeing, as Furich, whenever I look at him, reminds me of Buffalmacco, and me of Piero di Cosimo. No, objected the Baron. Piero di Cosimo in coloring is different from Furich and Buffalmacco. I can compare Buffalmacco today with Rossetti alone. Remember to subscribe.